constructed in the beginning, as I said. They immediately expanded in 1910 to add additional sand filters. So the initial capacity in 1905 was 4 million gallons a day. They got it up to 6 million gallons a day when they did the expansion to the north.
Do you know how much of average family of four would have used
Gosh,
back then?
I sure don't. It's a great question.
Half of what we use today, I'll bet.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's not even hard. You can't even talk about it in the same conversation of the summer store. But I don't know the actual number.
Okay.
That's a great thing to look up for the next tour. Did you want to ask something?
So you said this is the original part. So the part that looks like garages was the original?
Yeah, and I mean it was altered. So one of the there's some fuzziness to my understanding of this building that I'm hoping is going to be cleared up this fall and winter as we conduct additional studies on the building. Just because the documentation on it suggests, you know, there's this original 1905 one-story portion. They add the two-story portion. But I'm not really sure what they did to that original portion at that time.
But it looks more like it was a one-story building, and then they added a second story to part of it.
Yeah.
It does.
Yes.
But doesn't it look like the corner of that?
Okay, so
the L there, that's the oldest?
So to be clear, this is the oldest part here, and then when you see the larger component going in that direction, that's the 1920s edition. And then this is the 50s edition here.
Yeah, it looks like.
So one of the really cool things about this building is how sympathetic the additions are. Yeah. And you know, you don't immediately see when you look at the building until you study it a little bit closer. To the casual observer anyway, who's not an architectural historian, it feels very integrated. And they were, I think it really speaks to the civic pride at that time and the resources they had to carry it out. And again, you know, maintaining that design, which you'll also see, which I think is even more interesting, in the very small chemical outbuildings that we're going to pass along the way, where they maintain that architectural style and compatibility.
So like, these bricks look similar to the ones at the H&H waterworks?
I would love to know where these bricks were made. And maybe we can get there with additional study.
Can you do a component test on each building and see if it's different or not?
Probably the records would be a better source than looking at the brick itself, but maybe a combination of the two. Okay, so the bats. Everyone wants to know about the bats. Bats like old buildings. The older the better. They have better access points. The bats that are interested in this building and are currently using it as a maternity roost are little brown bats. And Jim has some helpful illustrations so that you can see what a little brown bat looks like.
You don't have a dead bat, I hope.
He doesn't have an actual bat.
I'm not
You
that
have to come to the building Grange to get those.
Sort of spot these around the green.
Now the bats,
Yeah, that's the same
and I will
one.
tell you a little bit more
It's the same
about
ones in the Grange.
the later sections, but
they eat
focusing on the
mosquitoes. You
oldest
gotta
part of the
love 'em.
building
Yeah.
right now.
How big is one?
So are the bats in
The
the whole
wingspan
thing?
or just
No. So the bats are only
I guess that's what I've seen in the next
attic
building.
of this two-story portion of the oldest part of the building. They enter under the eaves. We
You
know
have bats in your belfries.
we literally have bats in our belfry. That is correct. We don't know how long they've been here. We think they've been here. We know that we've at least going back to 2017, which isn't very long. The colony was first identified. And I didn't tell you this at the beginning, but this site, it's a natural area, so obviously natural areas is involved in its management. Utilities still has an interest in the site, as does Operations Services, which is the city's facilities department, who is responsible for making sure that this building remains safe and secure in its vacancy. And so all three of those entities have a memorandum of agreement together to essentially manage the site. So natural areas, this building being in a natural area is really important in terms of what's going to happen with the bats. Because they have, as a stakeholder in the outcome of what happens with the bats, they have more power here than they normally would if this was just a building down in the city. And so they have already been bringing research scientists up, giving them permits to do access, have access to do research on the bats.
So they get to go inside?
They are mostly, they're really sensitive to studying the bats, disturbing the bats. So their research is mostly outside. What they're interested in is how many bats are here. We know it's a very large colony, probably the largest in northern Colorado, which makes it significant from a research standpoint. And why do we care about them? Well, lots of different reasons. First of all, what do bats do for us in terms of eating mosquitoes?
Mosquitoes.
Does anybody know how many a little brown bat can eat in one day?
Mosquitoes?
No, 1 hour. Sorry, I'm going to make it harder. 1 hour.
100.
Good guess, but way off.
In an hour?
Very close. 1,200 an hour.
An hour?
Yes, that is
Yeah.
a powerful insectivore.
They're rather voracious, aren't they?
Yes.
1,200 an hour.
The other cool thing about little
we have
brown
no
bats
mosquitoes
is
up
not all bats
Yeah.
are colonizing bats.
Good question.
They don't all create colonies, but this species does. It's a species of concern in Colorado, which means we're watching them, we're paying attention. We're worried about them to a certain extent, not just because of the ecological role they play, but because white nose syndrome is moving west. White nose syndrome, if you don't know, is a fungal disease that is affecting bat populations in the east, endangering the size of those populations. And it's a fungal disease that thrives in humidity, but as our climate changes, it's moving west. So we're watching for it to arrive in Colorado, and all of the bat ecologists who work in this region are studying this site and are very interested in it. I actually got to go to a meeting with natural areas with all the bat scientists, and they were very worried when I showed up because they thought I was going to say, you've got to kick those bats out and save that building. And I said, that's not what I'm here for. I care about the bats. I want to find out why you care about the bats and what's such a big deal about this so that we can figure out a way to work together. So that's what we're trying to do right now.
Why do they think it's one of the biggest colonies in the world?
They do what they call emergence studies, where they set up infrared cameras, and when the bats will come out at night.
Well, I think they can count them, but I
And they can count them.
Why?
Oh, why here?
Yeah.
Well-
I mean, this is not like, if it wasn't here before 2017 or
Okay.
some sites the last 10, 20
Yes.
years, where were they before, and why are they congregating here now?
There may be a better answer to that I don't have. I know that colonies move, and this colony could move at some point. Some colonies will stay in the same building and continue to reproduce there for generations. There are certainly colonies that have been studied in Great Britain that have done that. Here, again, we don't know exactly how long they've been here. We don't know how long they'll stay, but we certainly know that the location next to the river where they have a lot of midges, mosquitoes, there's all kinds of great insects in this. And most importantly, this building has ideal conditions for them in terms of humidity. So what you have, first of all, let me just tell you a little bit more about what you can see from the exterior here. This concrete cap that's on this side of the building is covering some of those chambers of unknown depth that I referred to earlier. This concrete cap is a safety hazard. So one of the concerns and the reason why this fence is here is because we don't know what the current structural stability of that cap is, and we don't know what happens if you fall through. So never ever, ever, ever walk on that in order to get a closer look at this building.
So it's like a basin or a reservoir?
So yes, so there are interior filtration basins, and then there were exterior basins that were attached to the outside. And this is capping, when they decommissioned the site, they capped some of those exterior basins. But again, we don't have clear documentation on what exactly did they do, did they fill any of it.
But they're all dug, they're man-made.
They're all man-made.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's humidity that is created through those holes in the ground that impacts the interior humidity of that old building. And it has a belfry, an attic, where they like to hang out. So it's perfect for them. It's their favorite part of the building. And bats like certain parts of buildings. They typically don't take over entire buildings. They take over areas where they're safe, protected. And what are they doing in there, by the way? Does anybody know?
Breeding?
Breeding. It's a maternity roost. So they're only here between September and April when they're raising their young. And I'm sorry, April and September is how I should have said that. So they have recently vacated, as far as I know. I think they're gone. Maybe they're still hanging around. But this is the time of the year that they go away. And so this is our time of the year to come in and study the building, which is what we're going to be doing over the next 6 months.
So
and
they
without
migrate
disturbing
like
them.
to warmer climes, or?
Yes.
This
They-
is
they're
one of the
insect
things
eaters.
the scientists want to
Insects
know.
go away in the winter, Sharon.
Right,
You don't see a lot of mosquitoes in December.
thank God.
Yeah, so where are they going? Where are they hibernating?
Are they putting trackers on them?
Much bigger mystery than you would think, because tracking bats, even though we know we can track birds, we tracked all kinds of species, apparently tracking bats is super tricky. So one of the things that they're studying is, what's the best way to track the bats, just technologically speaking? What kind of trackers work best? And they have to weigh like 1/100 of an ounce or something crazy. So that's another thing they're doing. And then they don't want to track the bats in such a way that they're going to negatively impact the bats. So, you know, it's a very sensitive process.
So if the gals are here for the maternity ward, where's the guy bats?
I don't know. That exceeds my bat knowledge.
They're hanging out at the town pond.
Okay, so
They're
the
they're
bats.
at batting practice.
I wonder if they go like to Carlsbad Caverns or the big caverns in Mammoth.
Please get out all your bat puns. Let's get them out now.
You said you knew that was gonna happen.
You're driving me batty. There.
Touche.
You'll see them at dusk. So if you're up here at night, dusk, right before the natural area closes, you can see one or two kind of starting to emerge. Has anybody ever watched a huge colony emerge, like in Austin under the bridge or anything?
Yeah.
It's
Carlsbad
not like
Caverns.
that. It's not like, woo, and you know, they darken the sky. But there are a lot of bats. I've seen video footage, and the number gradually increases, and then it comes to its maximum, and then kind of wanes down, and then they're all gone.
Carlsbad Caverns, they pretty well darken the sky.
Yeah, yeah.
That's, I don't know how many, but there was millions.
So the bats love the old part of the building. We don't, in our new modern world of preservation, where we're trying to do integrated resource management, we're not going to come down with a hammer and say, get the bats out. Operations Services thought about it because this is a maintenance headache for them. That building is full of guano and urine. I started looking into the literature. What do preservationists do when they have bats in the belfry?
It's an adaptive reuse.
It's an adaptive reuse. So
sell
yeah,
guano.
so I actually
It is,
said when I went to
Do
that
something with
meeting
the
of the
guano.
bat scientists, this is the biggest bat house in Larimer County, and that's how I'm thinking about it right now because there's no other use. It's literally mothballed, so it might as well be a bat house while we figure out what to do with it.
The bats need a place.
Fort Laramie in Wyoming tried to put up bat houses to keep them out of the buildings, but it didn't work. They preferred the buildings. And it's dry up there.
So Sharon, you just talked about a really important problem with just saying, oh, we'll just close off the eaves, close off their entry points, they'll go somewhere else. That is actually a very stressful thing for them and often leads to major population decline or just unknown what happened scenarios. So yes, you can fully exclude bats from a building where you don't want them to be. But you really need to have a good plan and you have to know that it may not succeed. So it's much better to figure out a way, and this is what's happening, by the way, in Great Britain. So think about all those old churches in the British Isles. Get this fact, 60% of all of the pre-16th century churches in Great Britain have bats, major bat colonies living in them. Not all of them are being well managed, but many of them are. So this is where the literature is coming out of, is Great Britain. They're looking at various ways to gently move the bats into the part of the building where they are not going to impact human health, damage interior historic fabric. And there's all different ways that they're working with, you know, high frequency sound, physical barriers. So what we're hoping is that ultimately we will come up with a solution like that here that will be more protective of the interior of the building, but not kick the bats out altogether. Speaking of human health, little brown bats do not transmit rabies. You don't have to worry about that. Not all bat species. I think there are something like 47 bat species in the United States. Only 7 of them transmit rabies. And of those 7, I think 1 human a year in the United States contracts rabies from a bat. It's really not, we're afraid of bats. We're culturally terrified of bats for all kinds of reasons. But that one is very much an unfounded fear.
That must have started in Transylvania.
Maybe it did. However, humans can get histoplasmosis from
Somebody
bat
smacked
urine and
that lady.
feces. typically in very humid environments, which we don't have, so it's a lower health risk here. So again, there should be a way, especially in a building that we don't currently have a management plan for, to keep the bats in their healthy roost colony for the foreseeable future without it just being a non-management scenario. So that's what we're working towards.
Interesting.
Okay, so any more questions about the bats or this original part of the building?
The building. So behind these wooden, are those actually just windows then?
Yes, they're kind of access bays, basically. If you see them from the inside, so there's a spiral staircase just in the middle of those two bays that are farthest to the left, and that's not actually like secured to the floor. So we're not entirely sure how we're going to get up to where the bats are, but that area back in there again is like one of the main sand filtration areas, and each one of these is a sand filtration bay, basically. And again, the 1920s portion of the building, the 1950s, each one of those was a capacity expansion. So in the 20s, let's see, I remember my numbers. When they did the 1920s expansion, they got it up to 9 million gallons a day. And they added some more basins to the site out to the north and one of the little chemical outbuildings that you're going to see. So you'll see that similar architecture. And then once we got into the post-war era and our second really big period of expansion in the community, we got some 1947-ish changes out there as well as this 1950s expansion. So in the 50s, once that part was built, I believe it was 20 million gallons a day. So it operated at 20 million gallons a day, so it grew from 4 all the way to 20 over the course of its operations. But then after the Safe Drinking Water Act passed in '74, they actually had to reduce the capacity down to 13 million gallons a day because of the turbidity requirements. There was so much turbidity in the water that they couldn't operate it at its full capacity after 1978-ish, when those requirements went in.
You mean there wasn't, before the 1974 Water Act, there wasn't any federal control about no standards?
There were standards for safe drinking water, but they weren't comprehensive the way that the '74 legislation was.
Huh.
So the public health regulations were evolving over the course of the 20th century, as was, of course, concurrent with that, the technology that allowed those public health requirements to be met. But there was a significant change in the 70s.
I was amazed. I remembered researching something and found out Loveland, where I live,
Yeah.
didn't have to could put their sewage, everybody could put their sewage right back into the river until 1926.
Yeah.
And actually,
And it's one of the reasons it's upstream from Fort Collins.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Maren, you said you
Bald eagle.
the additions were
No, I think it's an
sympathetic
No, it's a bald eagle.
because of pride.
Well,
Were people coming up here, or was it just the workers? Because now
mostly, yeah.
people.
No, I mean now, of course, it's it's very much a public site.
No?
At that time, no, there was no public access, which was what makes it so interesting to me. And you see that with some of the other, when we were, I'll get into this a little bit more later, but we've prepared a draft, a National Register nomination on this property, which we needed to do last summer in order to seek the funding to do the historic structural assessment, which we're going to be starting this fall. And so when we were doing that documentation, we got kind of, the rudimentary basics on the history of the building. And at that time, what was I going to say? Can we back to your question?
Pride and
Oh, yeah,
people
the
coming
pride.
up here.
So we started looking into some of the, are there other documented water treatment facilities in Colorado that we could look at? And there is one, well, there's the Boulder treatment plant that you may know in the Boulder Canyon, which is a really cool building from the early 20th century. 20s, I want to say, but I'm not sure. There's another site that's been well documented down around Denver. And you see that they all have that in common, this type of, that some of the fact that there's some decorative, elements is sort of surprising to see, in that 20.
On a building no one would see.
Yeah, I would love to have a more full explanation of that. And my generic current explanation is, you know, civic pride, but I'm sure there's more to it than that.
That's the way
Jim,
they
jump
built
in.
Sure. Just as a larger context, for a lot of communities, some of their first public employees had to do with public works. It was usually a city engineer was among the first employees, and that engineer's job was to plat the streets and to build a water system. And so to have a lot of community pride, it was also because it was one of the first sort of municipal efforts of the community was to get fresh water and to manage that. So
And when you
that's
get-
part of that culture.
That's a fantastic input. And when you get, you know, a bond issue passed, you certainly have a public, you know, interest in, you know, not just the water, but, you know, the quality of the facility. But yeah, it's fascinating to me because it really was.
Yeah.
The superintendent lived up here. Does anybody know, well, Wayne, you probably know who Herb Alexander is. Herb Alexander was the superintendent up here for the last 40 years of operation. He came up here in 47, raised his family up here, and was here until sometime in the, maybe it was 79 actually, I think, when he retired. And he's legendary, you know, in utilities, because this was his home, you know, for decades, and he had so much pride of ownership in the operations and the quality of the operations, and it really speaks to the role of just one individual and functioning as a public employee and having this kind of iconic role. Everybody knew who he was, you know, everybody up and down the canyon and down in the community, you know, celebrated him for, you know, keeping things running up here year round. There's neat oral histories with him, or his wife and kids, I can't remember, does anybody know? Has anybody ever seen those? But you can find those in the archives that talk about their life up here, so if you're interested. And there's a photo of him. Jim, final handout.
Okay.
Can you hand
Oh yes.
the photo of there's some staple historic photos of the site, the interiors, because I know you're interested in seeing that. And the